Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Dr. Susanne Seperson, and this is our 11th episode of the podcast, Antisemitism and the United Nations and in Society on hmTv. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Mr. J.D. Solomon, a writer of historical fiction as well as a medical book written with his father, Dr. Yale Solomon, on macular degeneration. He wrote the historical novel, The Tinnin Killings, in 2008, based on one of his wife's ancestors, an Irish immigrant who served as a Union officer in the Civil War, and most recently, a historical novel called Home News, a novel of 1928 about events in his hometown of Bayshore on Long Island, New York. It is set in the Jazz Age, filled with bootleggers, cops, and news reporters. As a student of history, our discussion today will focus on anti-Semitism in America in the early 20th century and the responses by the Jewish community and its supporters, and a few notorious cases involving Jews, some more known and some less so. So now it's indeed my honor to welcome Mr. J.D. Solomon. So let's start with some questions about your background, if I may. So could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, your family, and what in your background do you think influenced your career path?
Most of my career was as a journalist and editor. I started in daily journalism and working in Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey. Then I kind of took a detour into the realm of educational publishing and ultimately ended up back in journalism, but in education journalism. I was the editor of two sister publications, one which served K-12 school administrators and the other that served college and university presidents and administrators. And always been a kind of a student and lover of history. Wrote that book, The Tinnin Killings, about my wife's ancestor while I was still working. The second book was a project of retirement. And then I kind of found myself serendipitously making presentations about historical true crime, which I do to senior groups here where I live in New Jersey. I speak 2 or 3 times a week over most weeks of the year to various groups on topics, including similar ones to what we're going to be talking about today, as well as other great historical crimes, the Lindbergh kidnapping and the Leopold and Loeb case, things like that. So it all kind of came together and worked out just the way you kind of wanted it.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to hearing about these true crime stories, and as well as, of course, many of them are connected to Jewish themes as well. So let me just ask you, did you experience any anti-Semitism while you were growing up?
You know, nothing serious. The community Bayshore that I'm from was then very diverse. We had 2 very strong Jewish congregations, conservative and reform. And the closest thing as a kid to anti-Semitism that I experienced was the historic country club in the town that was known forever as one that just didn't accept Jews. It was just kind of accepted. That was what it was. And you know, my father, who was an ophthalmologist in Bayshore and whose partners and colleagues at the hospital were all members of this club, but he wasn't. And his position was, you know what, the hell with them. We don't need them. There's another, you know, beach club in town. We had a backyard pool, so he didn't golf. So it wasn't a big issue. It was just a fact of life. And then I think the only time I experienced overt anti-Semitism, I was in a small newsroom in New York, in Westchester County, and a colleague was sitting next to me and talking, I guess, to her mother or somebody about a rental situation, and she used the phrase, "He was trying to Jew me down." And I just kind of looked at her, and she looked at me and she didn't recognize that she had said something offensive. And, you know, I did struggle with how to deal with it, and ultimately decided that I wasn't going to deal with it. It was just one of these things. But that was really it. When I went to college in New England, there were quite a few people, friends of mine, who had never met a Jew before, from towns in Massachusetts or other places. And, I was the first Jewish person that they met. And that struck me as very weird. But, it kind of was an eye opener. But no, there was no other overt instances in my life about it.
Jack, that I know the Bayshore area because I was a professor at Dowling College for many, many years. And so I know, one of the temples as well. So you're right. It is a diverse town, and until something happens to you, I just think as young people, you just live your life. You don't, conceptualize beyond that until you have a few more experience, or you read and you learn, and you can put it into context. So that's where I think I'd like to go now, is into the historical context. You were saying?
Because really, post-war phenomenon of anti-Semitism was much different than pre-war. And we'll talk about some of the examples, but before the war, the first decades of the 20th century, it was okay to be anti-Semitic. I mean, and outwardly so, in your face so. It was okay. There was also the systemic, sort of invisible, institutionalized anti-Semitism that did go beyond the war and into the 50s and 60s, of where, you had higher education institutions that had quotas for Jewish students. You had white shoe law firms and hospitals and banks that wouldn't hire Jews. That was a legacy of the first half of the 20th century. It persisted probably through the 60s, but by the 70s, largely ended. It was so. The war really was, I think, a delineating moment in how American Jews experienced anti-Semitism.
So we'll do this somewhat chronologically, and I know you're interested in some criminal cases. So let's start with anti-Semitism in the early 20th century and some notable criminal cases that involve Jews. Let's begin with the case of Leo Frank, a Jew in Georgia. For our audience, he was lynched by an anti-Semitic mob on August 16th, 1915, for allegedly murdering a 13-year-old girl, Mary Fagan. So do you want to continue the story from there? And for me, what's always interesting, beyond each of the cases as we'll go through, is what impact did this have on people's thinking? And did it have ramifications in a wider way beyond the specific case?
I think it did. And in fact, it is still reverberating today, that case. So yeah, just as you said, and the coverage, the media coverage of that case, fanned by the rise of yellow journalism, which was, the Hearst and Pulitzer, whose newspapers across the country and others, was just constantly referring to him as the Jew, and it was just the anti-Semitism was a feature, not a bug, of that media circus, which, by the way, that case was the first instance of a O.J. Simpson style media circus. And although I'm familiar with the case, I haven't studied it, in depth, but I think it's pretty clear what the anti-Semitic trope was behind it. The subtext of the blood-libel was there, and that has reverberated today. You don't have to scratch deeply around the internet to find instances of far-right influencers who are raising that very case and referring to it as with the blood-libel slander.
What really struck me when I looked at the case a little bit was that it was a complete travesty of justice, because he was convicted and he was sentenced to jail, but a mob broke into the jail, pulled him out, and lynched him. And so that, that right then and there is a violation of everything. But if I just may say, the new governor, he was never pardoned or excused or forgiven. He was ultimately got the pardon, not for committing or not committing the crime, but because the prison system didn't protect him from, doing his sentence. But to this day, he's legally guilty of having killed her, although there seems to be evidence that he was not the one who killed her.
So there is, and historians generally portray that case as a wrongful conviction. He was convicted, he was sentenced to death, and then the governor commuted the sentence to life. And that's after that he was, that a mob broke him out of prison and lynched him within sight of the victim's home. Interestingly, the leaders of that mob then went up to very shortly thereafter, to a mountaintop, I think it's called Stone Mountain, near Atlanta, and where they founded what was then the modern day Ku Klux Klan. And it was his case that, and the response to it, that resulted in the formation of the Anti-Defamation League, of course. Today, as I said, you don't have to scratch very hard around the internet to find references to that case from far-right influencers who are now, as is often happens, you talk about revisionist history, and who are presenting this as actually maybe it wasn't a wrongful conviction. But historians that I've seen generally are convinced that it was a wrongful conviction. But it was a horrendous experience for American Jews, I'm sure, to have been reading this coverage in the newspapers.
That ultimately will bring me to something else, but I'm going to respond personally. Whenever I hear of a terrible crime and I find out that it was committed by someone of Jewish background or faith, it's particularly disturbing to me, because I feel when that happens, it almost besmirches the name, or it can be used to besmirch the name of Jews everywhere. And so that becomes a very serious problem. And certainly this case was used that way.
Right. So there was another case 9 years later that was a horrific murder case involving Jews. And that was the Leopold and Loeb killing in Chicago. But what was interesting was that case did not spur a wave of anti-Semitism. There was very little, if any, kind of undercurrents of anti-Semitism in that case. There's been a number of theories about why. Just for anyone who's not quite familiar with it, it was these two college friends who decided they wanted to commit the perfect crime, and they picked a victim at random, and his name was Bobby Franks, I believe, and it turns out that he was a cousin of one of them. And they murdered him and expected to get away with it, and they didn't. They were quickly found, and there was a so-called trial of the century. Clarence Darrow was their defense attorney. He didn't get them off, but he got them off from the death penalty, and it was seen as a horrendous, terrible crime, but emblematic of, a lot of people consider emblematic of the laxity of the Jazz Age and the decline in morality of American youth. But it didn't spark the anti-Semitism. And one hypothesis that I have, that I don't know if it's accurate, but I suspect that the fact that the victim in that case was Jewish made a difference in that regard. That if it had been a Gentile 13-year-old, it might have had a very different feel about it, and perhaps harken back to the Leo Frank case.
Well, what I found fascinating, you're absolutely right. There were allegations that the perpetrator of the crime of murdering Mary Fagan, the one in Atlanta, that it was a black man who did it, and so there was a whole uproar there, which we can look at. But I think what was important about the Leopold Loeb case were a few things. One, their families basically disowned them. Two, it took place in Chicago, up north, not in the South, in Atlanta or Marietta, and so on. Three, the part that I really wasn't aware of is that these two men, Leopold and Loeb, were lovers. And of course, the crime of homosexuality was huge. So that's why I was alluding to, there's this idea of shame. Well, this was double shame. Ironically, in terms of the outcome, you would like to think, I would like to think there's justice somewhere, at least down the road. But in this particular case, I think it was Leopold who was murdered by an inmate. And Loeb, ultimately, his sentence was commuted, much earlier, and he ended up moving to Puerto Rico, getting married, even though, he might have been bisexual, whatever. He became a well-known bird lover, or, ornithologist. And he died in 1976, which is not that long ago. And yet Loeb's father was the vice president of the Sears Roebuck stores. There doesn't seem to have been any backlash that I was aware of at all. So it was really had very different responses. It may have, as most things have multiple causes, but the response was so different to the two cases. Now, I don't know if geography plays a role in it or not, or as you say, the victimhood, or the gender and the religion of the victims, but it really was quite different. And I had read about your the things that you talk about and the talks that you get, and I recognized many of the characters, but this was one that I did not recognize, and it relates to the Ku Klux Klan. We don't normally think of women being active in the KKK, but what can you tell us about Daisy Douglas Barr? And she had, again, many conflicting roles. So I turn it over to you.
So Daisy was part of this huge Christian revivalist movement in the early 20th century. And then she got associated with some Klan members, and one in particular, D.C. Stevenson in Indiana, and she started speaking on behalf of the Klan and sort of commingling Christian revival kind of themes with the Ku Klux Klan. She, for a while, was a very popular speaker and commanded huge audiences. And then she had a falling out with the Klan. But as with this, she was really emblematic of what was happening in the first couple of decades of the 20th century with the Christian revivalist movement, which was huge. I mean, preachers like Billy Sunday would be preaching to audiences of 100,000 people. And it was Christian nationalism. And they were advocating that America, saying that America was founded as and should be a Christian nation. Very similar to what a lot of the Christian nationalists today are saying. And Daisy was part of that. Now, while the preachers, Billy Sunday and some of the others, were not overtly anti-Semitic. They were not preaching hatred towards Jews. But certainly what was the question that was begged about, if America is to be a Christian nation, where would that leave Jews? And the KKK had the answer to that. They made no bones about it. So, for instance, the Colorado governor, who was a Klan member in the 20s, vowed publicly that he was going to fire every Jewish and Catholic faculty member at the University of Colorado. This was the kind of in-your-face anti-Semitism that the Klan, which Daisy was associated with, were espousing. I mean, they led boycotts of Jewish businesses, ostensibly because they were open on Sundays. But really, it was about anti-Semitism. They harassed to the point of exclusion Jewish politicians, office holders, and the key thing that's really important to know about this is that this was not a phenomenon in the South. This was in the Northeast and through the Midwest, the industrial Midwest, and into the West, Oregon, California, Colorado. And it was huge. I mean, as many as 1 in 5 Americans who were eligible to be in the Klan, meaning they were men and they were white and they were Protestant, were either members or aligned with the Klan. So it was huge. And preachers like Daisy and others were sort of bridging those two movements, the Christian nationalist revivalist movement and the Klan.
As I read about her, as I said, I had never heard of her before. She was the Imperial Empress, or leader of the Indiana Women's Ku Klux Klan, but she was also an active member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she was a Quaker. So she was a minister in charge of 2 prominent churches. And then she was the vice chair of the Republican Committee in Indiana. So it almost feels like she didn't just schizophrenic in terms of what her orientations were, and yet they coalesced in the form of anti-Semitism. Ultimately, if I recall, she was thrown out of her positions and lost her influence. I would like to go on to others, but I think we're going to take a little break. And I want to turn to Father Charles Coughlin, who was the first of, I will say, the media influencers in the early 20th century, and his relationship to Henry Ford and so on. So we have a long history of anti-Semitism in the United States that many of us may not be aware of. And so I look forward to turning to you to part 2. So I want to thank our audience for turning to this episode of Anti-Semitism in the UN and in Society. And I appreciate my guest, J.D. Solomon, for sharing his perspective on his historical perspective and the ways we deal with anti-Semitism. So we will continue shortly with the second half of this interview. And in the meantime, I hope that our listeners of hmTv, until next time, make it our time. Take care and be well. Thank you.